Hello everyone, this is chapter 22 on evolution by natural selection. So in this chapter we're going to talk about the rise of evolutionary thought, so how people used to view evolution, what is some of the evidence for evolution, we're going to look at some case studies and then the patterns and the processes involved. Evolution by natural selection was actually formulated by two different scientists independently of each other, and it helps explain how the organisms that we see are adapted to the environments in which they live in. So there's 5 key attributes of life, and this is the one that we're going to talk about today, the evolution one. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, and it basically explained the theory of evolution with a pattern and a process. Something that actually wasn't done before. So these ideas were actually revolutionary for the time because no one had dared to challenge them, as I guess the ideas of special creation had been dominating the world for about 2,000 years. So we're going to talk about 3 of the models, and then we're going to talk about the modern model as well. So the Greek philosopher Plato, he claimed that every organism on the planet was a perfect essence and type that was created by God, and it was unchanging, so it could never change, and it had never changed. So this type of thinking was known as typological thinking. And then a little bit later on, Aristotle came up with this great chain of being, which was kind of like a ladder where species were still fixed. However, they were organized into increasing complexities, and there were higher and lower organisms. And here, the only thing that was higher than humans were angels and God. And after the 1700s, these ideas were still really popular. And it wasn't until here that we started having a little bit more thought through Lamarck. But again, this whole thing with Aristotle was, there was a better species kind of on the next step. And in 1809, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, he proposed a formal theory of evolution where everything started by spontaneous generation. Of course, now we know this is not true, not correct. But in this scenario, organisms would move up the chain over time, becoming better or more complex. And he believed in the idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics, which isn't necessarily correct. So there is an idea of, something that's passed on to the future generations. However, he thought, for example, that like if a giraffe would stretch, that amount of stretching would eventually go down to the next generation, and then their offspring would be able to have longer necks. So for example, if you were weightlifting and you became really strong, and you had kids before this, your kids that were born before you were a bodybuilder would just have an average build, but the kids you would have after becoming a bodybuilder would be a lot stronger and more muscular than those that were born before that. And of course, we know this isn't true. It would be the same thing if I told you that if you lost an arm, your kids would also be born without an arm. Darwin proposed that this change happened through time and that it wasn't linear. So I know this image right here is something that you guys all have seen before, where they show a chain of people on human-like organisms, but that's really not the case. You always hear about people talking about the missing link, but there is no missing link because evolution is not a linear process. And again, there's a big misconception that evolution is only about how humanity originated, but it's not really the case. Evolution helps explain how organisms change through time. All organisms on the planet, not just humans. I mean, there's a lot more than just that. And of course, we're always very egocentrical and think that all of everything that we do and are revolves around us, and evolution would be no exception to that. But it applies to every organism on the planet, and we happen to be just another one. So what his pattern and process had to do with was variation among the individuals in the population, and those variations becoming highlighted by those organisms that produced more offspring. So let's take, for example, the Hemsworth brothers right there. They have traits that every organism has, every human has, every male has, for example. They have a face, they have eyes, a nose, they have hair, ears, same characteristics. However, they have different versions of those genes, very different characteristics, although they're still the same type of characteristic. However, if we didn't live in this society where they're like, oh my God, you're going to have kids with this market? Are you crazy? I'm sure they'd have a lot of babies. And that's kind of where his pattern or his process is explained. There's a term known as population thinking that kind of helps explain how these groups of organisms change. It's not necessarily one organism evolving. We're not Pokemon. We don't just go from one level to the next level. It's actually a group thing, and not necessarily that group at that time, because chances are there's not going to be a lot of change in one generation, of course, unless you're like bacteria, which we'll talk about later. But it's important to understand that evolution works on the group, I guess, on the group pattern. So here you see a branch, that's a branched pattern. That's a little bit more accurate, especially when it comes to like human evolution, where you have an ancestor here, and then every kind of little pre-human you see, those are all populations of organisms. They're not necessarily an individual one. They're probably remains that we found. However, they represent a population that kind of split into two. So we don't know what that is. We don't know what it looked like, but we do know that we shared an ancestor. Again, it's not a missing link. There's no chain. It probably could have been maybe something here that was what gave rise to both lineages. We really don't know, but what we do know is that these things change through time. So whatever this group of organisms decides is attractive, that's what the next generation is going to look like, or going to get closer to looking like that. The theory of evolution was revolutionary for a couple of reasons. First, it was because everyone thought that species were static, that they weren't going to change. So it replaced that typological thinking with the population thinking. So again, not the organism, but the group of organisms. And it actually had a process and a pattern that you could explain through observation and experimentation. Charles Darwin described this process as descendants, or descent with modification, which basically just means that there's change over time from parent to offspring. So again, this one right here was really important for explaining this pattern that species, first of all, change through time, and two is that these species are related. So when they thought that a dog was a dog and it's always going to be a dog, it always was a dog. Well, that one particular individual was. However, it came from a lineage that began from the ancestors of wolves, or wolves themselves. So here we see the Eastwoods. So you have father Clint, and then you have Scott on the other side. So they look like each other, but they are a little bit different to each other. Some of their characteristics have changed, have been modified, and that's what descendant with modification is. After you mate, those genes combine with somebody else's, and they lead to a different combination of alleles. And that's kind of what evolution highlights, is the differences that lead to making more babies. So let's look at some of the evidences. Fossils are traces of organisms that at once lived on this planet. And together they make up what's known as a fossil record, which is basically a collection of organisms that we think existed a long time ago. We typically rate them first by relative ages, and this is by looking at the layers in which they're found. So young layers tend to be on top and older layers tend to be on the bottom. The way we talk about organisms that lived at some point, we're talking in geologic time. I'm not sure how old you are that you're watching, but at this time I am 30 years of age, okay? I know what 10 years is like, being alive for 10 years, okay? I know what being alive 20 years is. I know what being alive for 30 years is because I have a reference mark, right? But let's say that somebody asks you, what do you think it's like to live for 100 years? I mean, 100 years is a very long time. But then now imagine 1,000 years. Imagine 10,000 years. Imagine 100,000 years, a million years. And then think about organisms that lived on this planet 65 million years ago. It's very, very difficult to understand that concept because we don't have anything to compare it to. So in this case, we try to refer to things in periods and in eons and things like that, so that it makes it a little bit more understandable. So here we have a fossil record, and again, things that you would find on the bottom of the layers of rock would typically be very old. Again, this is 510 million years ago. And then over here on top, you would have things like maybe 280, and progressively they get younger, maybe 275 million years ago. But again, just remember this is a relative time scale, so we would say this is old and this is new. We can actually now assign absolute ages to things because of the way we use isotopes. So isotopes are not stable atoms, but they degrade at a constant rate. So if we know what that rate is, we can actually find how much of each isotope is present in a rock sample, and we can tell you how old something is. We can do the same thing for humans in the forensics field, for example, carbon-14. So you have radioactive carbon. So carbon is typically known as carbon-12. But carbon-14 is a radioactive isotope. So the moment you die, you stop taking in carbon-14. So carbon-14 starts to decay. And based on how much of this you have left in your system in a ratio to this, then someone can estimate your time of death. Radiometric dating has actually been really helpful, dating some of the oldest rocks to about 4.6 billion years ago, with the earliest signs of life being close to 3.4 to 3.8 billion years ago. Many of the fossils that we currently see are actually evidence for extinct species, so species that are no longer in existence. And Darwin interpreted these extinction events as, evidence that species are dynamic, that they've changed through time, through the Earth's history. Overall, we estimate 99% of the biodiversity on Earth actually being extinct, so it doesn't live anymore. There is also this thing known as a loss succession, which is the pattern where we link species that live in the same area, kind of showing us the changes through time by looking at that fossil record. So typically we're going to see old primitive features towards the bottom and features that look more like the modern extant species closer to the top. Now the features that we see in between, those are known as the transitional features. So those are in between the ancestral and the derived species. Again, they provide really strong evidence that this organism or these groups of organisms look different a long time ago, and then the populations that exist now look a little bit different, and we can see kind of the in-betweens. So again, for example, here we have some tetrapods, and as you can see, they share some of the same characteristics. They're just a little bit modified, of course. Vestigial traits are evidence that things change through time because it's a reduced or modified structure that really has no function anymore. For example, your tailbone. So these ideas these features that we see are inconsistent with the idea of things like special creation that say that, you know, organisms were created with a purpose in mind. Because, I mean, what would be the purpose of having something that is not functional? Some of the examples of vestigial traits are, again, some whales and snakes having tiny little hip bones and leg bones that don't really work. Ostriches and kiwis, they don't fly, but they still have wings, so they're modified wings. There's fish that live in caves that have no eyes, but still have the eye sockets. And then, of course, we have the tailbone example. Another type of evidence we have is actually being able to see how species evolve, and we have a couple of examples that I'll share with you. During his voyage, Darwin collected a lot of information about a lot of the different finches that he saw, as well as other organisms, and he typically found that the organisms that lived in those areas were somewhat similar. Again, kind of explaining the descendant with modification. That's something he did see with the finches. Here we see the Galápagos Islands kind of off the coast of Ecuador, and this probably happened about 1.5 million years ago, and over that time span they were able to see some significant changes. Phylogenetic trees are diagrams that help us illustrate the taxonomic groups and the ancestor-descendant relationships. In this case, here is the phylogenetic tree for the Galápagos Finches, and you can see how some of them have very different shapes and depths of beaks, things like that. We also have homologies, and there's 3 types of homologies. We have genetic, developmental, and structural. Of course, genetic homology meaning that DNA similarities are what's relating these organisms. And here we see the hemorrhoids, and they're made of the same DNA that basically comes from each of their parents. However, they're just a little bit different, but you can definitely see how some of those characteristics are still there. So if you are made from similar DNA, that means that you're going to look similar to what the parent did. And in this case, that's what you see. This is the most fundamental homology, because from here, we kind of have the others build upon that. And again, here we have an example with human and fruit flies. You look at the amino acid sequences that are kind of abbreviated here with letters, and you can see that they're quite similar, at least in this section. And of course, you have those little differences here and there. But overall, what this really tells us is that every living organism is made of the same DNA. I mean, we all have DNA, and that's kind of the functional unit that has allowed us to change over time. Developmental homologies are those that you see in embryonic development. So here we see the pharyngeal pouch, and this is for chicks, humans, and house cats. You also have a tail towards the bottom. Structural homology is adult morphology that's similar. For example, here we see the different limbs of different animals. So here we have humans, and again, you can see the same feature found throughout all of these different groups. So because you see them in all these different groups, it probably means that we share some percentage of our genetic information. And of course here, all of these organisms are vertebrates. So we all have a spine and a brain and a nervous system that's a little more complex. Speciation is nothing more than one group of organisms splitting into two, and then the descendants from each of those groups becoming different. Internal consistency is also a very important concept, and this is observation of data from independent sources telling you the same thing. So for example, if you hear somebody saying, hey, you know what, I saw your girlfriend with somebody else, and then your tia tells you the same thing, and then somebody else that doesn't know either of the people who told you tells you the same thing, there's probably a good chance that it's happening. Not that I wish that upon you, but it's independent sources of information that are telling you the same thing. And that's what's one of the thing that evidences for evolution actually tell us, is that this is taking place throughout the entire planet, basically. One of the evidences that we see that has this internal consistency is the evolution of cetaceans, which are your whales and your dolphins. The fossil record identifies very peculiar features in the ear bones, and it can actually be traced back to some terrestrial or semi-terrestrial aquatic forms of organisms. Like, for example, I think the hippo is the closest living relatives to both whales and dolphins, and it is in fact. And of course, you see some of the bones that you see in a hippo modified in whales and dolphins. And again, here's just a little diagram that kind of shows you a transition between a hoofed semi-aquatic organism to the modern whale. Descent with modification is, again, one of the more successful and powerful evidences for this theory, because it helps explain things like vestigial traits and how these organisms are related in things like neighboring islands. And special creation, on the other hand, doesn't really explain that. Many researchers had proposed that things evolved. However, Darwin was the first that described the process, of course, and that process is natural selection that can explain how these changes in organisms happen. Some of Darwin's inspiration for a lot of his ideas came from different places, including work from other scientists. He also saw some interesting things as he was experimenting with pigeons and pigeon breeding in terms of artificial selection. And of course, basically what he found was that all of the pigeon varieties that you have, they came from a wild type, and they're just modifications of that, selected depending on the person who was breeding them wanted. Thomas Robert Malthus wrote this book called An Essay on the Principle of Population, where he described what's known as the struggle for existence, which is nothing more than more organisms are going to be born that can actually survive. So meaning that they're going to compete for resources. And Darwin combined some of those ideas to kind of come up with the theory of the idea of natural selection. And he made a lot of observations on artificial selection, and he knew that there was some type of component that you were able to give to the next generation. The notion of this struggle for existence was also really important because there is variation in population, and what this does is it really highlights that variation. And again, artificial selection is just us choosing what characteristics or features we want in an animal. And here you see a German Shepherd and a poodle. Again, this one's make a really good hunting companion. This one, it's really good at getting thorns on its hair when you take it to the park. So both Darwin and Wallace came up with that same idea. However, he thought of it first, and he kind of published that on the Origin of Species. He had four postulates that were kind of the ones that established what his theory of natural selection was, or evolution by natural selection. The first was that variation exists among the individuals. So there's just a little bit that makes each one of us different. Some of the traits or differences are heritable, meaning that it has to come from a genetic component. It can't be something that you get within your lifetime, like for example, piercings, or I don't know, something like a funky hair color, or things like that. It has to be genetic. It has to be passed on via reproduction. The third is that the survival and the reproductive success are different based on something called fitness, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and that some of the subsets of these groups are going to survive and make more babies. And of course, evolution is going to be an outcome of these four postulates, and this is what's known as the modern theory of evolution by natural selection. Biological fitness is the ability to make babies that are fertile and that are able to create their own. And this is really important because it's not talking about organisms being the strongest. And you've probably heard the phrase the survival of the fittest. It's not talking about like fitness as in like doing CrossFit 5 days a week, or being a super athletic runner, or whatever it is. Fitness is actually only referring to the ability to make babies. And that's really it, because it doesn't matter if you're a very, very muscular, fast cheetah. If you cannot make babies, anything that was genetic about your physique or appearance, it makes no difference because you don't pass it on. So those genes are going to be lost. So the important here is making babies, and the features that make babies are the ones that are going to be more pronounced in future generations. And that's what fitness really is. It's just the ability to make offspring. Adaptations come after natural selection takes place. So natural selection is the only process that gives you adaptations, and this is one of the things that increases an individual's fitness in a given environment. And selection is just the differential reproductive success of some of those traits. You can actually test and see natural selection in a bunch of different ways, but here we're going to look at two case studies. The first on drug resistance. So tuberculosis, or TB, is caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So it infects your lungs, it causes fever, coughing, sweating, weight loss, and some of the severe complications are deadly. In the 1900s, it was actually getting kind of almost gone, but then in the 1980s there was this resurgence of tuberculosis, enough that in 1993 the WHO declared it a global health emergency. So there was this young man from Baltimore that was diagnosed with TB, so they took him to the doctor or the hospital. They gave him antibiotics for 6 weeks, and then they gave him an antibiotic known as rifampin for an additional 33 weeks, and he was cleared for maybe 10 months after the initial infection. However, 2 months later, he started seeing some symptoms, and he was readmitted to the hospital. 10 days later, from that second admission to the hospital, he died despite of any of his antibiotic treatments. And what happened was, after testing him, they found out that the tuberculosis that was in his lungs was completely resistant to the antibiotic they'd been using. So the DNA from this bacteria was found to have a mutation in a gene called the RPOB gene, which is a part of RNA polymerase. And if you remember RNA polymerase from 1306, then you know that it's the enzyme responsible for replicating RNA. So what this RNA polymerase change did was it basically made the drug unable to block it. So because the RNA polymerase was different, the amino acid sequence of the enzyme that was used to replicate the bacteria was actually unable to be affected in any way by the drug. So this mutation prevented that binding, therefore meaning the bacteria would continue to replicate without any inhibition. So in this case, variation existed in this population. So there was a mutation in a couple of bacterial cells that allowed it to be not susceptible to the drug. The variation was heritable. Because it was a genetic mutation, again, bacteria cells only reproduce asexually. So any type of reproduction in this case is going to lead to heritable variation. So any mutation in this case. There was a variation in reproductive success. So those organisms or the bacteria cells that were susceptible to the antibiotic died. Those that were not susceptible continued to reproduce, eventually taking over his system. So in this case, selection occurred by the fact that this allele had now greater numbers in the population of bacteria. So the process of natural selection works on individuals, but it actually shows as evolution in populations. What you're really looking for is changes in allele frequencies in the entire population, not in individual organisms. And again, there's a reason for that. If you have an organism that has a lot of genetic mutations, it doesn't mean it's evolved, it just means it has variation. So the moment that it breeds and it passes on that variation to the group, that's what evolution would be. However, if that organism doesn't really make babies, then it didn't really, the population didn't evolve. It's just the organism had a lot of mutations and it was not successful. So in this case, that's why we look at the population. The resistance to a lot of antibiotics is actually skyrocketing. So there's a lot of different strains of bacteria that have killed people and continue to kill people, including things like MRSA. Which is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. And that's really scary because like you could have it on your skin and not know it until you get a staph infection because it kind of just lives on the surface, and it just, one day if you have it, it'll pop up. If you don't, then oh well, good for you. But in those cases that you do have it, it could be particularly opportunistic. So. And then we have a second case study where the Grants were conducting a long-term research experiment on the population of ground finches in the Galápagos Islands. So they had already found that the depth and size of the beak had a genetic component to it. So during the middle of their studies, there was a drought that killed off about 84% of the birds by starvation. So this was a perfect example of a natural experiment, which is, you don't have you don't manipulate it, but Mother Nature basically changes something and it leads to changes, and then you categorize those organisms or subjects as whatever they fit into. So in this case, there was a measurable change in the characteristics of the population. So the finches that were left had deeper beaks that were larger for cracking larger fruits and seeds. So over time, that's what you saw, an increase in the beak size and the depth of the beak. However, in 1983, the environment changed again. So you had about 10 times the average rainfall. So what happened is the cover of plants or the vegetation changed on this island. So because organisms are doing a couple of things most of their life. They're either feeding, they're fleeing from predator, or they're finding mates. So in this case, because the food source changed, they were eating differently, and those organisms that were able to secure food tended to be smaller with pointier beaks. And in this case, that's what was making more babies. So as a result, in this population, beaks got smaller and shorter as well. So again, here's a little graph showing you initially kind of where they were, and then this was during the first drought. So the only ones that were surviving were the ones with large, deep beaks. And then after that major increase in rain, oh sorry, that was in 83, closer to here. Let me erase that. So somewhere around there, you had that large amount of rain, and then it started decreasing as the vegetation cover changed. So in this case, there are genes that are polygenic, meaning that they control multiple traits. In this case, beak depth is one of those polygenic traits, so it actually results from two genes, the ALX1 gene, which is the beak shape, and HMGA2 gene, which is the beak size. Then we have differences in things like adaptations and acclimations. Although natural selection does appear to be a very simple process, sometimes people don't understand it. So let's clarify some misconceptions. The first is that evolutionary change occurs in organisms. It doesn't. Natural selection sorts out what's already there. So the variants that are in the population, that's what natural selection works on. Evolutionary change doesn't occur in organisms, it occurs in populations. And again, here in this case of these giraffes, a selection doesn't cause the neck length of a giraffe to increase in individuals, it actually works on a population. Another misconception is that evolution is goal-directed. It doesn't have a goal. Evolution happens as a consequence of differential reproductive success. So whoever makes the most babies, that's what you're going to see in the next generation. Evolution perfects organisms is another misconception. There is no such thing as a perfect organism. Not all traits are adaptive traits. Some of them are actually trade-offs in some cases. For example, peacocks, their really long, colorful tails make them great to get caught by a big cat in the jungle. So it's not necessarily an adaptation that's useful, but it's good for making babies because it shows the females that it's, or it has a great diet and access to resources. Also, it's really important to, again, to restate that individuals don't change, the populations do. In the case of the birds, we were looking at the average beak depth and size over time. In tuberculosis, again, the cells didn't necessarily all change. It was one cell that was resistant, and then that allele became more common as it reproduced. In contrast to what Lamarck had said, these guys, they were not necessarily changing when they were selected. It's actually when they're making babies, that's when the selection is occurring. Acclimatization is not the same thing as evolving. For example, boxers go sometimes at high elevation to train before a big fight. And the reason they do that is because when you're higher in elevation, the air gets quote unquote thinner, meaning that your body has to work a little bit harder to get oxygen into your lungs to get it to your bloodstream. So your body's response to that is to produce more red blood cells. And those red blood cells help carry more oxygen so that you can continue to perform your activities. However, when you go back down to wherever you're fighting, if you're a boxer, the number of red blood cells you have is going to still be with you. So as a result, you're going to be able to get more oxygen to your lungs, making you tire less quickly. That is not evolution. The person has not evolved. They went to an environment in which the phenotype changed in response to their environment, a temporary change. When you go back and now you're there for 6 months, wherever it is you call home, the number of red blood cells your body has goes back to normal. So that's an example of how people sometimes confuse adaptation for acclimatization. Evolution by natural selection, again, is not goal-directed. It doesn't have a purpose. It just happens as a consequence of whoever makes more babies. That's really what it's about. Another thing is that mutations don't occur to solve problems. They're random. They just happen sometimes. If it's useful, then it becomes more common because that's what's going to make more babies. So that's what this really is about. It's about who's going to make the most successful babies in that given environment. Another thing is that I forgot to mention before is that evolution isn't necessarily, or adaptations don't happen because organisms need it. For example, polar bears. If you don't have a thick fur coat, it's not that you need one, but if you don't have one already, you're going to die. The ones that have the thicker coats or slightly thicker coats are going to live longer, and those that live longer have a better chance at reproduction because you can't reproduce if you're dead, right? So over time, the organisms that have the thicker coats, those are going to be the ones that are around long enough to reproduce. So if you had a thin coat, you probably died at the beginning of the season, and there's no mating for you, so you don't pass that trait on to the next generation. Okay, moving on. Evolution is not progressive. There is no such thing as a better or more complex organism. Everything that's on this planet has been here for millions and millions of years, just like you have, or our lineages have. There are things that are lost and things that are picked up as evolution of, or as a result of evolution. However, it doesn't mean that we're better than any other organism. I mean, just think about this. If you get locked in a room with an alligator and the alligator is a little hungry, I'm putting my money that on the alligator that you're not coming out of that room. So there are scientifically no such thing as a higher or a lower organism. In terms of biological complexity, that's a different story because there's organisms that, of course, have more features than others. Things like sponges are very simple compared to something like a chimpanzee. However, it doesn't make it higher or lower. Everything is well adapted to the environment in which it exists, and that's really it. Vestigial traits are basically traits that were remnants of a feature that was lost over time. They don't have an increase or a decrease in fitness whatsoever, so they're just there as a transitional feature. Silent mutations happen all the time, and these are changes that happen just because there's a change in your genome, and they don't necessarily change any amino acids in the sequence of the proteins that you make, so they're typically not adaptive. So even though Charles Darwin had a pretty good idea of how some of the things that he was talking about worked, he didn't really understand fitness trade-offs. So he looked at the peacock and said, why in the world would this animal invest in such a long tail if something's going to catch it by the tail and eat it, like a tiger? Well, that trade-off is always because there's something to be gained by that feature. So for example, peacocks that have long tails and colorful tails often have a better diet, like I had mentioned earlier, and they have a better immune system because of all the carotenoids they ingest. However, if you got to risk it, if a female sees that long tail, probably says, hey, this peacock has access to some resources, has a good diet and a good immune system, and they haven't died yet, therefore they could be a potential mate. And then that whole sexual selection now starts coming into play. Another example of a fitness trade-off would be, for example, the size of eggs or seeds that the parent makes so that the offspring could be successful. Also looking at rapid growth and a long lifespan, and bright coloration, which typically attracts predators. In this case, also attracts mates. Genetic correlation is nothing more than when one allele for one trait actually causes a change in another trait, and that's known as pleiotropy. And the lack of genetic variation is also a constraint for evolution. So natural selection can work on existing variation in a population. So it can work on the genes that are already there, but it can't get you something that's not even remotely close. So for example, if you wanted to see or ask a question like, is it possible that humanity would ever develop wings like those of an angel? Which I know is kind of a weird question, but I'm recording this kind of late, so it's okay. So there's really no history there. You have nothing that resembles something like a wing. You have arms that have bones that are not hollow, which are not ideal for flapping around because they're really heavy, unlike bird bones that are hollow. You have nothing protruding from your back. You have no muscles there. You have arms, which you use for mostly everything. However, there's no feature there. There's no history there. There's no gene that you can say, okay, if I turn on this gene, this is going to make me have feathers. So there's really nothing that I can tell you about that. And then on the other hand, like, could humans ever have naturally purple hair? Well, if you look at any organism in nature, Do you see organisms that are purple, that have either purple hair or purple feathers, or blue hair or blue feathers? And yeah, like some birds have blue feathers, and it's made by a pigment, which is coming from a protein. So technically, it's more likely that we could develop something like, blue hair versus something like wings, because there's already a history there, if that makes sense. You already make pigments, you already have hair, you know, it's more likely than you developing wings when you have no features that resemble them. Um, Again, traits are also environmentally constrained, so there's a lot of constrictions, of course. Um, Typically, there is a lot of change, or in this case, natural selection, working when you have environmental change. This is when your abiotic or biotic factors are changing over the geographic range of where this population lives. And you have different examples here, but the perfect example would be the desert. So the desert is hot, okay? So there's a lot of organisms that rely on the sun to warm you up, a lot of lizards, a lot of snakes, things like that. Cacti also are I guess, well adapted to dry conditions and hot conditions. So what were to happen if the climate here in the desert started becoming a lot more rainy? So you have less sun, meaning that those reptiles probably couldn't get the same energy from basking anymore, so they'd have to eat a lot more frequently. Because they're eating a lot more frequently, they have to move more, but since they can't bask, the only ones that would be successful would be the ones that were a little more reliant on metabolic fuel from the food that they ate. So in this case, you probably could have a lot of organisms potentially go extinct, only the ones that would have mutations that are beneficial over whatever time span we're talking about. Again, we're usually talking a few generations, so sometimes it could take 100 years, sometimes it takes thousands of years, and even millions. It's really important to note that evolution and natural selection are not the same thing. Evolution is the pattern of change that we see, and natural selection is the process that results in adaptive evolution. So the only way to get an adaptation is through natural selection. But there are other processes, genetic drift, gene flow, and mutation, that can also lead to evolution without any respect to fitness. So we will talk about some of these in later chapters.